Welcome to Grow's webinar on, let me get rid of my little window here, employment law update. I had a chance to kind of review the slides, and I think we're up for a few laughs as well as learning some great information. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer.
So what I will play a role in today is being your facilitator. So as Mary goes through all of this wonderful, useful information, we will take moments of pause so that if you do have questions, you can certainly ask them. You can also utilize the chat throughout this session, and I will be able to cut in. And Mary, you can focus on what you need to focus, but I'll let you know when we have individuals who have specific questions. And again, this is being recorded. So if you do have a question that you'd like not to be featured in the recording later, just let me know and I can certainly edit you out. But I'll go ahead and have Mary take it away.
Great, thank you. And I would like this to be informal. I think we're all remotely, and here I am presenting from my home office with my 3 kids working remote school in the other room. And so, you know, this by very nature is going to be informal. So welcome, good afternoon. This is an employment law update, which we get after I get right through this mandatory legal disclaimer that our general counsel always makes us include. So we'll zoom right on past that. And this year has been something. So I had different.
I'm just going to stop you for a moment, Mary, because it seems like somebody may have their audio on. So if you could turn your audio off, that'd be great. Okay, there we go. Go ahead, Mary.
Okay. I wrote this year has been something, and I had many different variations of the word something and plenty of words that started with the word S, but I decided, to take that out. It's just really hard to get excited about 2020. I've been providing legal updates for 22 years now, and I've always been challenged each and every time to sum up in a very short, succinct way of what the year entails. But I feel this time a brief summary is a little bit easier than in the past because we all know what it's been like and nobody has to give too much explanation. So the worst part is that it started off so promising, right? I think that we were all ready to rock and roll. Business was good. Winter was light. I don't know if you remember Christmas, December, we were in the 40s degrees. It was just a really light snowfall. And our biggest national emergency was, I think, murder hornets. So we were doing good. But then March hit, much like that arrow right there, right? It just wasn't the very best year. But it wasn't all COVID all the time, although it certainly felt like that, right? And I'm purposely going to steer clear of direct COVID-related laws like the FFCRA and the 200 and some executive orders that we've had. I mean, I couldn't cover that today, even if I tried. So in an effort to propel us along the path back to normal, I will be covering the rest of the legal world. And surprisingly, there were a number of key legal developments that snuck through under the cover of this pandemic. And we will try to cover those highlights today. So this is sort of our cheat sheet here of what we're going to cover. And the first one, right? What is sex? Usually that doesn't require any sort of explanation. We either know sex for procreation purposes or sex as far as gender. But in the crazy world of employment law, which you all know, otherwise you would not have wanted to attend today, words take new meanings when it comes to HR and employment, and sex has been on a path of developing a new meaning in the employment world for quite some time. So there's been no new statute that has been developed, even though we have gone on this path of trying to define what sex means in this day and age. So if someone tells you, hey, there's a new statute, there isn't. We are still going off Title VII, and Title VII was developed and passed in 1964. And that was a groundbreaking civil rights law that prohibited employers from discriminating against employees because of their race, their religion, national origin, and sex. And so if you remember a few years back, the EEOC, which is the federal agency of the federal government that's armed with writing discrimination in the employment world, they started defining sex as you couldn't discriminate against a man or a woman because a man acted too feminine or a woman acted too masculine. So they took the position that sex was could be discriminatory if there was a preconceived stereotype of what a female employee ought to act and behave and dress like, and what a male employee ought to act and dress and behave like. That has morphed into what has gone through the court systems in the United States of whether we as a country were going to protect employees that were transgender or homosexual, and that they were going to protect those. And some states said yes, some states said no. And as you know, in Michigan, we had yet to protect that, even though perhaps you have been progressive in your own policies that did protect it. There was no federal or state protection regarding that until June 15 of this year. So for a while, the Supreme Court has been resting on a case that determined whether workplace discrimination because of an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity was going to be lawful or unlawful under Title VII. And on June 15, we got our answer. And the answer was that the United Supreme Court, which is the law of the land, which interprets sex out of that Title VII case from 1965, they now, the law of the land is all employers, I'll put a little asterisk there on what I define as employers, cannot discriminate against an employee for their sexual orientation or their gender identity. It was a surprising 6-3 decision. It was a surprising majority author who was very well known as a conservative judge. And the rationale for protecting sexual orientation and gender identity was surprisingly easy. And what they said, which a lot of these cases and legal reasoning, you want to scratch their head if they're talking in a different language most of the time, especially when it gets to the Supreme Court, but not so in this case. So I've actually quoted here on the screen of what they said. They said an employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. And the court gave an example, and this example really is surprisingly easy to follow. So, for example, an employer has 2 employees, both whom are attracted to men. The 2 individuals, to the employer's mind, materially identical in all respects, except that one is a man and one is a woman. So if the employer fires the male for no other reason than the fact that he is attracted to a man, the employer is terminating him for behavior the employer tolerates in women. So the man's sex, which is the word that's being defined in Title VII, is the obvious distinguishable factor. And the court says that is what will no longer be tolerated. So we didn't really both sides didn't really celebrate or not celebrate that decision because we were right in the middle of COVID-19. But that is groundbreaking law. That has been a topic of discussion for at least a decade as far as a hot topic that we've talked about. And so getting final conclusion is, in the employment world, just really significant. So what does that mean for Michigan employers? So if you employ fewer than 15 employees, this decision does not apply to you yet. And the reason why I say yet is because Michigan has its own civil rights laws. And Michigan, without exception, has always followed federal civil rights laws. So we suspect that Michigan will likely follow suit. And certainly the EEOC has been on this path for a while. In the EEOC, if they come knocking on your door, it's going to be very hard to rely on Michigan law when they are asking about your discriminatory practices or your civil rights protections. So if you have 15 or more employees, though, gender identity, transgender status were always protected, or it has been protected in Michigan for a bit. So that's the same. The new is the sexual orientation is now also clearly covered, because if you have 15 or more employees, you will be covered by Title VII, and Title VII now has been defined as prohibiting sexual orientation or discrimination on transgenders. But some questions were left open intentionally. Those questions are left open, and they were very explicit about leaving those open. Supreme Court said that we don't purport to address issues about how employers are going to handle bathrooms or locker rooms or anything else of that kind. So Michigan employers should add transgender status and gender identity and sexual orientation to their EEO policies as protected categories. So if you're a business owner, you are already required to have a EEOC policy in your handbook. And even if you don't have a handbook, you are required to have a standalone policy. You're also required to have a standalone harassment policy. That's not new law there. And so you want to revise those policies. If you have sex in your policy, which I'm sure you do, that something to the effect of I'm an employer that I don't discriminate based on race, religion, all of those things that I just highlighted in Title VII, sex will surely already be in there. And so if you just want to leave it, that it'll be technically legally correct. But practically, there are a lot of reasons to be explicit, including risk management, diversity and inclusion. If you want to enhance recruitment and public relations and customer expectations, you'll want to be explicit that you are following it. So you may want to further define sex as actually putting in that you won't discriminate against an employee based on sexual orientation. So what else do you do? So now, because sexual orientation is a protected category, you need to treat that like any other issue regarding harassment, threats of violence, gender identity status, where somebody makes a complaint that they are being treated unfairly or disproportionate to those that their counterparts. And so what does that mean? That means you need to put on your HR hat and your investigatory hat like you always have with other incidents, and you want to investigate. You want to take prompt and thorough remedial action. You want to maintain confidentiality. You can't disclose your investigation. You want to provide employees with the support and ensure no retaliation. All of those things you're all very familiar with. How to conduct an investigation has not changed. What else should you do? You want to recognize the gender of an employee identification in the application of your policies and the use of your facilities. So the EEOC has already issued specific guidance on dress code, bathroom choice, locker rooms, and so has OSHA. And I'm not going to have time to walk through those, but if you have any questions regarding those, they have been posted for years on the EEOC website or the OSHA website regarding providing single occupancy, gender neutral facilities, or multiple gender neutral restrooms with lockable single stalls, those types of issues. And so practically when you're going through these, your employees may fall on different ends of the spectrum here on their acceptance of this or their resistance to it. So you want to make sure that you're leading by example, that your organization is following the law and that you are respectful of any and all employees, regardless of their sexual orientation or their sexual identity. So you want to make sure to use appropriate word choices on referring to employees that have stated that their sexual orientation or their gender identity. You want to make sure that you train supervisors, they are your front line, to use the gender appropriate word choices. And if you're not sure, ask the employee which noun or pronoun he or she prefers. Supervisors, as I stated, should be trained, and employees should be trained or at least intentionally communicated to about the company's expectations for how they should treat LGBTQ employees in the workplace. And you want to consider a transition assistance and response plan. If an employee, I have seen where employees want to be very open about their sexual orientation or their road to changing their identity. And there's other employees that want to be very secretive and keep that confidential, other than to let HR know because their benefits may be changing or whatnot. So you want to have some sort of plan in place for employees that are on both sides of that spectrum so that they do not feel discriminated against one way or another, whether they're very open in their sexual identification or whether they're very private about it. So that's what I have to talk about, really that groundbreaking Supreme Court decision that happened in June. I'm going to move right on to political speech, which I have to tell you, I paused on whether I was going to include this in the update because by now we're all as sick of political and the election, regardless of what category that we fall into, as much as we're sick of COVID-19.
Hey, Mary, I'm just going to pause you for a moment. Does anyone have any questions in what Mary just covered? I'll let her have a moment to take a breath before she moves on to the next one. All right. Reminder, any questions that you have, go ahead and put it in the chat, but it doesn't seem like anyone has anything specific right now. So go ahead, Mary.
Great, Jennifer. And I'll try to remember to pause after this section 2. Okay. So I really struggled on whether I was going to dive into this because this is a very polarizing topic, and especially this year. But it does and will continue to seep into the workplace. So I did want to talk about things that we can protect. So obvious, these were the two candidates. And I don't think whether it falls into one party or another. I don't think I stepped too far out of line by saying that it was very unprecedented about the candidates in a way that they express their views of each other and how divisive those comments were amongst the American population, and how much politics were just seeped into the workplace this year. So, we have Trump saying or repeatedly saying that Biden was stupid and that everybody knows that. And we have Biden repeatedly saying that, he wished that he could just physically beat up Trump. And so those things were just really unprecedented of any presidential candidate before. And we had really, really strong beliefs. And so under democracy, one party always devotes its chief energies to trying to prove that the other party is unfit to rule, and both commonly succeed and are right. So the impact on the workplace, what we saw this year was these making national news about an Alabama factory worker who was discharged after refusing to remove a MAGA bumper sticker on her car. We had a waitress who was fired because customers complained that she was wearing a Tea Party bracelet at work. And in Mississippi, we had a bank supervisor who was discharged after coworkers complained about her comments on former President Obama's race on social media, which we largely still think of as a private social media account that's not, employers ought not to concern themselves about, but that line continues to get blurrier and blurrier. In others, we saw perhaps in a more grander scale, a sports commentator was suspended after tweeting that President Trump was ignorant and stated that his election was a direct result of white supremacy. We had an employer discharge employees who participated in a protest in violence in Charlottesville. And we had in Virginia, a woman who was fired from her job after raising her middle finger as President Trump's motorcade drove by. So really, these examples were meant to show that it was across the United States, in that there was a lot of tension and divisiveness. And I don't know if because stress was already at an all-time high because of what we saw with COVID-19, what we saw with an African-American death as a result of police force, or, the political race just got too much where we saw so much in the workforce where it lost productivity. There were environments that created a hostile work environment, that people were being harassed for their political views. And they had employees request leave of absence, and you had customers complaining because of various apparel that was being used with employees in the workplace. So the most obvious question is, can we just prohibit all political speech at work? The question isn't as easy as you would think. You as an employer, you should be able to say, yeah, there is such a right as constitutional free speech, but not in my workplace. Unless I'm the government, I still am in charge of having a healthy and productive and safe workplace for my employees. And if this is an aspect that's not creating a healthy, emotionally healthy workplace for my employees, then I'm going to stop it. And you would be right. There is no constitutional right to talk about politics in the workplace. There's no federal protection for terminating someone because they talk about politics in the workplace. And at least in Michigan, there's also no statutory right to be able to express your political views in the workplace. And employers are generally able to regulate verbal communications for sure, and even emails going back and forth that are subscribing or criticizing one political viewpoint or another. And certainly apparel, right? You would think that apparel would fall under a dress code, that you have to wear appropriate dress, and we don't want t-shirts that talk about, make America great again, or ones that I've seen, flush the turd, November 3rd. All those things, whether it was supposed to be said in jest or not. But as things are all employment law, it's not that easy. So issue number one is you need to concern yourself with the National Labor Relations Act. And you may think, well, Mary, I don't have a union at my workforce. I don't need to concern myself with the NLRA because that only speaks to union employees. Unfortunately, that is a very common misconception. The the National Labor Relations Act actually applies to every employer, whether you have a union workforce or not. It's more commonly applied when you have a union workforce, but we have seen a surge in NLRA complaints since the Obama administration because, and we'll get to this very briefly later, is under the Obama administration, the NLRA was very pro-employee and very protective of employee to the extent that we had not seen, at least in the couple decade career that I have had. And so the NLRA was really breathed a new breath of life, and it applies to all non-supervisory employees. And what it says is, look, you can't be retaliated, discriminated against, or harassed if you engage in protected concerted activity. Well, what's protected concerted activity? That is any complaint or issue you have regarding the terms and conditions of your employment. So you typically think of it as an employee complaining about overtime, or an employee complaining about not having enough breaks. You can't terminate somebody for that, especially when they are speaking in groups. So my first shift and me, we don't like all the overtime that we have to do, and we are upset and we don't want to work it. If that person doesn't work it, you can terminate them for that, but you can't terminate that person for expressing those views. So that is the most basic example. However, that continues to go, what's the terms and conditions of employment? So if political speech starts seeping in and they represent themselves and it's a group and they complain about this overtime and or not enough breaks, and they just so happen to be very outspoken regarding their political beliefs, you're going to be very hard pressed to get a clean termination from them if they're expressing their political beliefs, if it's the same time that they're also expressing their views on the terms and conditions of their employment. So you want to be careful with that. The same thing with ordinary discrimination. Can you ask an African American employee to remove a Black Lives Matter t-shirt? What's the consequences? So is there anything that's legally protective of that employee so that they are able to wear Black Lives Matter in your workplace? There's no legal protection because you own your own dress code policy, and you can, as long as there's a legitimate business need, or even if there's not, if they're an at-will employee and you hate the color red, you could have your employees prohibit wearing red into the workplace. And if somebody wears red, you can fire them. Now that's laughable and it's an exaggerated example, but in theory, that's possible. So what about Black Lives Matter t-shirt? In theory, you could terminate somebody for wearing that if it's not consistent with your dress code policy. But what about an employee who's wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt who's also protesting racial discrimination in the workplace? Those lines get a little blurry, huh? So it's with everything in employment law, it's not clear cut. You want to look at the total circumstances of what is happening, and you want to make sure you have policies that are consistently applied. So for example, if you apply your dress code policy in an inconsistent manner that disadvantages people based on race or another protected class, you're going to have a problem. So for example, if you permit a bracelet that says, "What would Jesus do?" WWJD, but prohibit a button with an LGBTQ rainbow or a BLM button, you're going to have a problem that you are treating folks differently based on protected categories if they translate the BLM to racial, which isn't a big leap there, right? You want your policy written clearly in your application and enforced neutrally. So another example, Whole Foods. I think I went past that. There was multi-state protests at Whole Foods because Whole Foods sent employees home for wearing a BLM and I can't breathe mask based on its customer-focused environment policy that prohibits any visible slogan, messages, or logos that are not company related. And there were mass protests of Whole Foods. So even if they were legally allowed to do that, folks took to social media and word spread about what Whole Foods did. And even if you could rationalize, okay, I can't have a person who's checking out wearing a mask that says I can't breathe or BLM. That's not the customer focused environment that we want. That's putting your personal beliefs on display. And even though there was nothing legally wrong with doing that, it was a customer relations nightmare to them. Same thing about calls for boycotts at Taco Bell and Starbucks. Starbucks likewise quickly reversed course after they got a BuzzFeed after BuzzFeed got hold of its internal memos explaining that BLM buttons were forbidden based on a dress code policy that prohibited attire advocating for political, religious, or personal issues that might amplify divisiveness. So Starbucks actually overtly endorsed BLM, donated $1 million to racial equity organizations, and produced 250,000 t-shirts with a BLM graphic for its employees. So even though if you legally can do those things, you do want to pause and consider what the social ramifications are in this environment. So allowing political expression opens the door to the opposite of political expression as well. So again, you want to review and update your dress code, solicitation, and distribution policies to make sure it says what you want to say in this ever-changing world. You want to train your supervisors on what to do on any given situation. And you always, though, want to insist on civility, dignity, and respect in the workplace. So overall, you want to look at it when you're thinking of protected concerted activity with these evolving political and social issues of, is it a group issue that I'm dealing with? If it is, it may be protected by the NLRA. And is there a nexus to work? Is what they're saying or displaying have anything to do with work? If it doesn't, you can continue to proceed down the disciplinary path, recognizing the social implications. If it is, you want to pause because you may be treading into retaliation, discriminatory issue. And then even if it's not a nexus to work, is there a connection to race, religion, national origin, etc.? Black Lives Movement is connected to race. And so you want to pause on that to see, is it the slogan, is it the personal belief, or is it the racial component that I'm dealing with? And of course, as we discussed before, is the employee at will? That's what I have on the political, and I kind of meshed the NLRB update because I do know we got started a little bit later, and I want to make sure that we hit most of the highlights perhaps before some of you need to log off. Any questions about the political and Black Lives movements as it impacts the workplace?
And as we wait for people to make any comments, just a reminder, if you could kindly turn off or put on your mute. If you are listening or you're joining, if you could put your mute on, that would be wonderful. Okay. Any other questions? It feels like a lot of people are just kind of taking it all in right now, Mary. And a reminder as well, we'll be distributing this PowerPoint. So as you're taking notes, if you do happen to miss a little something, don't worry, we'll be sending these out to you after today's webinar.
Great. All right. I'm going to motor on into the NLRB update. So when I say NLRB, that's just the National Labor Relations Board that enforces the NLRA, which is the statute. So I'm going to pause here again. Unfortunately, both sides of the political parties have used this federal agency to further their agenda. Much more than any other federal agency. So the EEOC can take some little pivots here and there, but the NLRB unfortunately takes wide swings regarding whether a Democrat is in office or whether a Republican is in office. So as I highlighted to you before, President Obama was very successful in getting nominations on the NLRB that furthered very, very aggressive and far-reaching employee protections. And then when President Trump got elected, he was very successful in scaling that back. And so that is the purpose of my update today. So for the past so many years under President Obama, they really hit on purple communications. And so what is purple communications? Essentially, purple communications is that protected speech that I was talking to you about. I'm an employee and I have a problem with the condition of my workforce. I think that they aren't sanitary enough. I think there's hazardous chemicals that I'm not being educated on, that I'm being forced to work with. I don't think the attendance policy is appropriate for all of our employees. You know, the working overtime, that sort of thing. Purple Communications takes it a step further. And it says, fine, that's okay that you're talking about it, but it's really absorbing the electronic technology of today. So purple communication is actually whether an employee has the ability to hop on their employee's email system and talk about protected speech, talk about this is wrong and that is wrong in a very grand and mass scale. And so previously it had always been no. The employee's email is the employee's property, just like the computer. You can't just take that home and use it for personal use. You can't use union spiel or anything on email system for the company. Under President Obama, that was switched, and employees had a right to use an employer's equipment, including work email, to try to get union interest and involvement in protecting their work environment. And so on December 17 of 2019, less than a year ago, President Trump was successful in overruling those purple communications that President Obama put on. And once again, employees have no statutory right to use your employer's equipment, including work email. So that was a huge victory for employers, certainly employers that are union free and want to remain union free. It makes that much harder in today that we're so focused on technology. And just think of right now where most of us are remote workers, how diminished it would be to be able to get union activity or a groundswell of union support when everyone's really scattered and disjointed. And so the fact that the employees can't use work email now is huge for employers that want to remain union free. Do I suspect if we're talking a year from now that the pendulum has swung the other way under Biden's governance, then the answer would be, I don't know if he could swing it in a year, but I'm sure in 2 years, the pendulum is going to be swung again. So that's what I have to say on the NLRB. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to move forward with the DOL update. So DOL is Department of Labor. And that is the federal agency that governs the statutes that talk about federal minimum wage and exempt versus non-exempt positions. So what I mean by exempt and non-exempt positions is there is a very old long-standing law that says all employees who work over 40 hours in a work week, which is a week, 7 days, must be paid time and a half of what their normal hourly rate is. And so when I say non-exempt, it's because if you have employees that fall under that rule, they're not exempt from it. So that means if they work over 40 hours in a work week, they need to be paid time and a half. If you have employees that are exempt from that, that's what I mean by exempt. And they're often called white collar exemptions. And so those are folks that you commonly think of as executives, your president, your vice president, CFO, your chief operating officer, those plant managers, those types of things. And then it also goes into administrative, which is by far the position that gets misclassified the most as exempt when they should be non-exempt. And then you have a lot of different exemptions for professional, like teachers, doctors, lawyers, IT is exempt in certain categories. But as IT and technology has become more common, a lot of employees that were exempt before are not exempt now. So if you are in IT and you employ somebody that's just really troubleshooting and is not creating software, more likely than not, they're non-exempt, which means that they are subject to an hourly wage in overtime over 40 hours. But the big news with this white collar exemption is about a year ago, we got all a good scare that we're going to have this huge increase on what it meant for employees to be exempt, because employers just cannot say you're exempt, you're not exempt. If you're exempt, you have to fall into one of those three broad categories that I was talking about: executive, administrative, or professional. So you have to have certain job duties, but you also have to meet salary. So you can't employ, let's say, your computer IT person and pay that person $15,000 a year and call him or her exempt from overtime. That would fail the salary test. So you have to have both meet a salary test and a duties test. And that has been that way since 1938. That is when the Fair Labor Standards Act passed. And those two requirements have not changed forever. What did change this year is the salary threshold. Before, it was 23,000 and some odd change that you needed to hit in order to have that computer person that I was talking about, as long as they create software for you and met the duties threshold. The salary threshold was only 23 some thousand dollars. No one was paying their IT 23 some thousand dollars and calling them exempt.
I mean, we actually worked with Mary on this. We just recently went over our salaries and the threshold question, and fortunately we were in compliance, but it was something that was recommended to us to really take a look at because there were changes to it. So I think it's an important aspect as an employer.
Bonnie, I was obviously able to share a little bit of what they've experienced. Any other stories that you've heard from others, Bonnie, that may relate to this?
I can't, not other stories, but I do know that, these topics that Mary is covering are great topics. There were a lot of aha moments for myself in some of this. I mean, there's no doubt that we are in changing times when it comes to employer-employee relationships. And it's critical as a small business or any type of organization, it's critical that you're on top of this. And I know that sometimes a lot of us don't have the time because we're wearing so many different hats. But if you don't take the time in the long run, it'll cost you more time.
Mm.
The two remaining points that I do want to just briefly, we are towards the end of it, is
Sure.
for those of you who have 50 or more employees, there are new employer forms that you'll want to use. There's no really additional employer requirement in those forms to even speak of. They're just new updated forms. So if you are FMLA employer, which is 50 or more employees, you do want to start using those new forms. You do want to take a look at the last couple slides. It's about the ADA and whether, because we're all required to work remotely now, or most of us, is whether they're going to use that against employers going forward with requiring remote work as an accommodation for somebody who has a disability. So the good news is the EEOC said, no, we're not going to automatically say that an employee can work remotely just because you've been required to do so as an employer, to have your employees work remotely during COVID-19. But it's not a home run for employers, because the EEOC and the ADA will still take that into consideration, that they were allowed to work remotely. So you're going to have to, if you want them to come back, if you have somebody that has a disability and they say, well, I should be able to work from home forevermore because I have asthma, I have something post-pandemic that prevents me from coming into work. I have diabetes, whatever, that makes it easier for me to regulate those things at home. You don't want to automatically just say, nope, pandemic's over, I'm not going to consider the remote work. You have to still go through a legitimate business reason why they cannot continue to work from home. But the good news with all of that is that the EEOC just did not say blanket, yep, you know what, you can continue to work from home, because employers were allowing that during that pandemic. And so it shows that they're able to work from home. You were given a little bit of grace, which is to say a lot, because the EEOC is usually very pro-employee. So the employers did get a win with that. And so when you are looking at working remotely post-pandemic, you want to make sure that you do have a remote work policy and agreements that's clearly defined, and that doesn't treat every position the same, because the law will require you to look at various positions of what can work remotely and what cannot. So you want to focus on the work performed, and you should want to make sure to have a policy that talks about your general guidelines. It is going to be moving in that direction post-pandemic about remote work and not coming in to work for the long term. So you want to really reflect on you as an employer of how you want to treat that. It is certain that both ends are not going to be protected. So if you're going to just go all remote for work, unless you're one of those unusual employers that's all you can do, you don't need to have a footprint, a physical footprint, that's great. But you'll no longer also be on the other end of the spectrum, an employer that requires everyone to work in your brick and mortar. So I just have listed here some things that you'll want to consider when you're looking at how you're going to treat remote work going forward.